January 5, 1943. Morning. 18 miles south of Cape Hunter, Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Red Cochrane commanded the aft 5-inch 38 caliber battery aboard the light cruiser USS Helena. His crew had just finished recovering from general quarters after the ship's task. Force bombarded Japanese positions at Munda. Now 4 Japanese Ichid-3A Val dive bombers were disappearing into the morning haze after their attack run. The raid had lasted 90 seconds. 1 Val had hit the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. The other 3 were running for home at wavetop altitude, already 2 miles out and pulling away fast. Standard doctrine said let them go. At that range, with those targets, hitting them was statistically impossible. Cochrane's battery had maybe a 5% chance of even getting close. But Commander Deke Parsons, a technical officer from the time, Office of Scientific Research and Development, who had come aboard specifically to observe this moment, gave authorization to use the special ammunition. He had traveled from Washington with 500 rounds of experimental shells loaded onto Helena 2 months earlier, under armed guard and strict secrecy. The gunners didn't know what made these shells different. The fuses looked normal, 5 inches long, screwed into the nose of a 54-pound high-explosive round, but the brass casing felt heavier than standard fuses, and there was a faint electrical hum when you held one close to your ear. Cochrane's crew fired 3 salvos at the departing aircraft. The first salvo missed. The second salvo also missed by about 50 feet, passing near the trailing Val. Then 1 shell exploded, not on impact with the water, not on a timed delay. It detonated in mid-air, 30 feet from the Japanese aircraft, close enough that the blast wave and shrapnel cloud tore through the Val's tail section and left wing. The dive bomber rolled inverted, hit the water at 200 miles per hour, and disintegrated. Cochrane and his crew had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. Their shell had exploded near the target without hitting it. Every gunner on Helena's deck saw it happen. Nobody understood how. What they didn't know was that they had just fired the world's first proximity fuse in combat, and that single hit was about to change naval warfare forever. The problem with shooting down aircraft wasn't new. It had been killing American sailors since 1941. At Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941, American anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of rounds at Japanese aircraft with minimal results. Ensign John Charles. England was serving as damage control officer aboard the battleship USS Oklahoma that morning. When Japanese torpedo bombers attacked at 0758, Oklahoma's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire with every weapon that could elevate. England stood on the main deck, directing damage. Control teams, as shells streaked overhead toward incoming aircraft. The 5-inch guns fired round after round with timed fuses set for altitudes between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. The Japanese were attacking at 1,500 feet. The shells exploded thousands of feet above their targets. They were useless. England watched the first torpedo hit Oklahoma's port side, then the second, then the third. The battleship began listing to port. Water poured through the torpedo holes. England stayed at his post, sending men below to close watertight doors and ordering others to evacuate flooding compartments. The list increased. 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Men started sliding across the tilted deck. England kept working, helping trapped sailors escape through hatches. At 0810, Oklahoma capsized completely. England made multiple trips into the flooding ship to pull men out. He saved at least 3 sailors before he was trapped inside himself. He drowned along with 415 other men when the ship rolled completely over. If American anti-aircraft fire had been effective, some of those torpedo bombers might have been stopped before they could drop their weapons. But the timed fuses failed, and England died. The math was brutal. A standard 5-inch anti-aircraft shell used either a contact fuse or a timed fuse. Contact fuses only detonated if the shell physically hit the aircraft, but hitting a plane moving at 300 miles per hour from a ship that's also moving and rolling in the ocean is almost impossible. Even the best fire control computers in 1943 could only predict where a target would be within about 50 feet. At combat ranges of 5 to 10,000 yards, that margin of error meant most shells passed harmlessly by their targets. Timed fuses were supposed to solve this problem. The gunner estimated the target's altitude and speed, set the fuse to detonate at a specific time after firing, and hoped the explosion happened close enough to the aircraft to do damage. But this required perfect information about the target's range, altitude, and speed. In combat, that information was always imperfect. The radar was unreliable. The visual rangefinders had trouble tracking fast-moving targets. The mechanical computers that calculated fuse settings were based on assumptions about how the clear target would fly. If the pilot changed speed or altitude, even slightly, the shell exploded hundreds of feet away from the aircraft. Harmless. By mid-1942, American gunners in the Pacific were having difficulty achieving consistent kills against attacking aircraft. Some ships fired for entire engagements without scoring a hit. The USS Enterprise burned through 1,200 rounds of 5-inch ammunition during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 and shot down 2 planes. The Japanese, meanwhile, were losing aircraft to American gunfire at a rate that barely slowed their attacks. The human cost was staggering. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, on December 10, 1941, Japanese bombers attacked Cavite Naval Yard in the Philippines. The submarine USS Helena was in dry dock, unable to dive, unable to maneuver. Her crew manned a single 3-inch deck gun with conventional timed fuses. They fired dozens of rounds at the formation of bombers overhead, attacking at medium altitude. Not one shell came close to its target. The Japanese bombed with precision. 5 bombs hit Helena. 1 penetrated the engine room and exploded inside the pressure hull. 4 men were killed instantly. Electricians Mate 2nd Class Sterling Cecil Foster. Machinists Mate 2nd Class Melvin Donald O'Connell. Electricians Mate 3rd Class Ernest Ephraim Ogilvy. Machinists Mate 2nd Class Valentine Lester Paul. The submarine was declared a total loss and scuttled in the dry dock. The 3-inch gun sat on her deck surrounded by empty shell casings from rounds that had detonated harmlessly at preset altitudes, while enemy bombers flew through untouched. By June 1942, the Navy had lost 17 ships to air attack in the Pacific. The carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, multiple cruisers and destroyers. Every one of those ships had anti-aircraft batteries. Every one of them had fired thousands of rounds. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, Lexington took 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes from Japanese aircraft. The carrier burned for 6 hours before she was abandoned. 216 men died. At Midway, Yorktown took 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits. She sank 2 days later. 141 men were killed. The gunners had done everything right. They had tracked the targets. They had calculated the lead. They had set the timed fuses based on the best available data. But the fuses detonated at predicted altitudes, not where the aircraft actually were. Close wasn't good enough. Admiral Harold Bowen knew about these losses. He attended the casualty briefings. He read the action reports. Every report said the same thing. Heavy anti-aircraft fire, minimal results. He also knew that in August 1940, before Pearl Harbor, the Navy had authorized a research project that might solve the problem. The project was run by a physicist named Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Tuve was 39 years old, brilliant, and had a reputation for taking on impossible problems. The National Defense Research Committee had asked him to develop a proximity fuse that could work in an artillery shell. Tuve said he'd try. The idea wasn't new. Engineers had been proposing proximity fuses since the 1920s. But nobody had solved the engineering problems. A proximity fuse had to fit inside a shell only 5 inches in diameter. It had to survive being fired from a gun, which created 20,000 times the force of gravity in 0.003 of a second. It had to withstand the shell spinning at 25,000 rotations per minute as it flew through the barrel. It had to operate in temperatures from 100 degrees Fahrenheit to -50 degrees. It had to include a radio transmitter, a receiver, an antenna, a power source, and a detonation circuit. It had to do all of this reliably, and it had to be simple enough to mass produce by the hundreds of thousands. In 1940, everyone who had looked at the problem seriously, including the British and the Germans, had concluded it was impossible. The British had started their own proximity fuse program in 1939, but made it clear to the Americans that they believed artillery shell applications were impractical. The forces were simply too great. The Germans had been working on the concept since the early 1930s and had developed over 30 different prototype designs. None worked reliably enough for mass production. By mid-1942, Tuve's team, officially called Section T, had spent 2 years working on the fuse. They had tested 17 different designs. They had built prototypes using optical, sensors, acoustic sensors, electromagnetic sensors. Most failed immediately. The optical fuses didn't work at night. The acoustic fuses couldn't distinguish between engine noise and wind noise. The electromagnetic fuses were too heavy. But there was one design that showed promise. It used a miniature radio transmitter and receiver built into the fuse. The transmitter sent out a continuous radio signal. When the shell got close to a metal target, like an aircraft, the radio waves reflected back. The receiver detected the reflected signal. As the distance to the target decreased, the frequency of the reflected signal changed due to Doppler shift. When the frequency reached a specific threshold, meaning the shell was within lethal range, a circuit triggered the detonator. It was elegant in theory. In practice, it required fitting a working radio into a space the size of a pint milk bottle and making it survive forces that would crush normal electronics into powder. The engineers who said it was impossible weren't wrong. The problems were genuinely enormous. The fuse needed vacuum tubes. In 1942, vacuum tubes were fragile glass devices used in radios and laboratory equipment. They broke if you dropped them. They shattered if you hit them. Firing them from a gun at 20,000 Gs should have been like putting a light bulb in a blender. Tuve's team worked with Sylvania Electric to develop a completely new type of vacuum tube. Miniature, rugged, built with thicker glass, shorter filaments, special shock mounts. The engineers had to rethink every aspect of vacuum tube design. Traditional tubes had long, thin filaments suspended between electrodes. Under high G-forces, these filaments would snap like guitar strings. The solution was to make the filaments as short as possible and mount them with spring-loaded supports that could absorb shock. The glass envelopes had to be thicker and shaped differently to distribute stress. The entire tube had to be smaller than a human thumb, yet tough enough to survive 0.003 of a second of crushing acceleration, followed by sustained spinning at 25,000 rotations per minute. Sylvania built 600 prototype tubes. 590 failed in testing. The tubes that survived had to be manufactured to tolerances that didn't exist in commercial production. Each tube was tested individually by firing it in a special centrifuge that simulated gun launch forces. Tubes that cracked or failed were discarded. The rejection rate in early production was over 60%, but gradually, through trial and error and relentless quality control, Sylvania learned to make tubes that could survive. By early 1943, they were producing tubes with a 90% survival rate. The fuse needed a battery. Normal batteries had liquid electrolytes that would spray everywhere under high forces. Section T developed a reserve battery that kept the acid and the electrodes separated until the shell was fired. The firing shock broke a glass vial inside the battery that released the electrolyte, activating the battery only after the shell had left the gun. This solved two problems at once. It prevented the battery from degrading during storage, and it created a safety feature. Unfired shells remained inert. The battery had to provide enough power for 15 to 30 seconds, which was the typical flight time of anti-aircraft shells. Then it had to die so that dud shells wouldn't remain armed if they fell back to Earth or into the ocean. Engineers calculated the exact amount of electrolyte needed to power the fuse circuit for 30 seconds and no more. The fuse needed an antenna, but there wasn't room for a traditional antenna inside the shell. The engineers solved this by using the brass fuse casing itself as an antenna. The nose of the shell became a radiator for the radio signal. It wasn't efficient by normal standards. The broadcast range was only about 30 feet, but 30 feet was exactly the lethal radius for shell fragments from a 5-inch high explosive round. The antenna design worked perfectly for the application. The fuse needed safety features beyond the battery. Shells were stored in magazines, transported on ships, handled by crews, loaded into guns. A fuse that could detonate prematurely would kill friendly personnel. Engineers built in multiple safety mechanisms. The battery activation required the G-force of gun launch. The radio circuit required the spinning motion from rifling. The detonation circuit required both the correct radio frequency return and a time delay. All three conditions had to be met for the fuse to arm and fire. This made the fuses essentially impossible to detonate accidentally, even if they were dropped, hit with a hammer, or caught in a fire. Everything had to be assembled by hand. Each fuse contained 130 individual parts: tiny resistors, capacitors, vacuum tubes, wires, springs, detonators. Women in factories across America assembled them on production lines, soldering components onto circuit boards the size of a silver dollar. The job required extraordinary precision and patience. Each solder joint had to be perfect. A single cold solder joint or misplaced component would cause the fuse to fail. The work strained the eyes. Women sat at benches under bright lights, using magnifying glasses to see the tiny components they were assembling. They worked 8-hour shifts, sometimes longer when production demands increased. Many of the workers didn't know what they were building. The project was classified at the same level as the Manhattan Project. The security measures were extreme. Workers were searched when they entered and left the factories. They couldn't bring in purses or bags. Personal belongings were stored in lockers outside the production areas. Armed guards patrolled the facilities. Workers were forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, including family members. They signed secrecy agreements that threatened prosecution for any disclosure. Even local police and fire departments were not permitted to enter the facilities without special authorization. The work areas were divided into sections. Workers in one section assembled specific components but never saw the complete fuse. Only supervisors and quality control inspectors saw the finished product. Workers were told only that they were building something important for the war effort and that their work was saving American lives. They worked in silence, assembling identical units hour after hour, never told that they were building the most advanced electronic weapon in the world. The tedium was broken only by the constant pressure for production. Quotas increased every month. Factories that fell behind. Schedule received urgent visits from Navy inspectors. Quality control was ruthless. Every fuse was tested before it left the factory. Fuses that failed testing were disassembled to determine what went wrong. Workers whose components repeatedly failed inspection were reassigned or dismissed. By January 1943, Section T had produced 5,000 working proximity fuses. The Navy tested them at Dahlgren Proving Ground in Virginia and over Chesapeake Bay. The tests were designed to simulate combat conditions as closely as possible. In August 1942, the cruiser USS Cleveland conducted trials using radio-controlled drone aircraft as targets. The drones were flown by operators on the ground who could maneuver them to evade fire, simulating the behavior of enemy pilots. The test was scheduled for 2 days. Navy planners expected to need multiple attempts to work out problems with the fuses. Gun crews would fire at the drones, observers would record the results, engineers would analyze failures and make adjustments. It was supposed to be a methodical evaluation process. It ended after 90 minutes. The gunners destroyed all 3 drones with 4 shots. The first shot missed. The second, third, and fourth shots each destroyed a drone. The Navy observers were stunned. They had never seen anti-aircraft fire that effective. Conventional timed fuses typically required dozens or hundreds of rounds to achieve a single kill against a maneuvering target. The proximity fuses were achieving 1 kill per shot. The Navy immediately cancelled the rest of the planned testing and ordered the fuses into production. There was no point in further trials. The technology worked. The only question was how fast it could be manufactured. The Navy immediately ordered the fuses into production and sent 5,000 units to the Pacific Fleet under guard. Half went to Pearl Harbor. The rest were distributed to specific ships chosen for combat trials. The USS Helena got 500 rounds. Helena's captain was briefed on the new ammunition. In November 1942, he was told the fuses were experimental and highly classified. Under no circumstances could they be used over land where duds might fall into enemy hands. Water only. Results were to be reported immediately. The fuses arrived in wooden crates marked top secret. The ammunition handlers heard the faint electrical hum from inside the fuses and called them spooky shells. Nobody knew if they would actually work. Commander Deke Parsons, a naval ordnance expert from the Office of Scientific Research and Development, had personally escorted the fuses to the Pacific. He had arranged to be aboard Helena specifically to observe their first combat test. On the morning of January 5th, Helena was part of a task force that had bombarded Japanese positions at Munda. The bombardment was routine. What wasn't routine was the 4 Val dive bombers that appeared just as the ships were recovering their float planes. One bomber hit the cruiser Achilles. The other 3 turned and ran. Parsons saw his chance. Fast-moving targets at long range over water. This was exactly the scenario the proximity fuses were designed for. Conventional fuses would be useless. He gave authorization to use the experimental ammunition. Lieutenant Red Cochrane's aft battery loaded the proximity-fused shells and fired 3 salvos. First salvo, miss. Second salvo, airborne detonation. 1 Val disintegrated. Every officer on Helena's bridge witnessed it. The shell had exploded in mid-air, nowhere near the water, and the aircraft had come apart. Parsons immediately recommended that all 5-inch batteries switch to proximity-fused ammunition for anti-aircraft defense. For the rest of Helena's service, her gunners would use nothing else. 6 other ships in the Pacific had received the same ammunition. The carriers Enterprise and Saratoga had loaded proximity fuses in December. Both ships had orders to test them at the first opportunity. On February 1, 1943, Enterprise engaged Japanese torpedo bombers during the Battle of Rennell Island. The carrier's 5-inch batteries fired 84 proximity-fused shells and destroyed 6 aircraft. Previous engagements against similar numbers of torpedo bombers had required hundreds of rounds per kill. The gunners noticed immediately that something was different. Shells were detonating near the targets even when the range estimates were off, even when the aircraft maneuvered. The proximity fuses were compensating for aiming errors. By March 1943, every major warship in the Pacific Fleet was requesting proximity-fused ammunition. The factory production rate was 500 fuses per day. That wasn't nearly enough. The Navy needed 40,000 per day to supply the fleet. The Navy authorized an emergency expansion. Crosley Corporation in Ohio, RCA in New Jersey, Eastman Kodak in New York, General Electric in Massachusetts, Sylvania in Pennsylvania. 5 companies, 110 factories. By December 1943, production reached 40,000 fuses per day. By the end of the war, American factories had produced 22 million proximity fuses at a cost of over $1 billion in 1940s money. The effectiveness was undeniable. Naval statisticians tracked the results obsessively. In 1943, ships equipped with proximity fuses fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds. 25% of those rounds used proximity fuses. Those 25% accounted for 51% of all kills. A proximity-fused shell was 3 to 4 times more effective than a conventional timed fuse. Against kamikaze attacks later in the war, the difference became even more dramatic. During the Okinawa campaign in 1945, American ships faced massive kamikaze assaults. Hundreds of Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American vessels, willing to die to sink a single ship. The proximity fuse was the primary defense against these attacks. Ships firing proximity-fused ammunition had a 70% higher survival rate than ships using conventional fuses. The statistics were stark. One destroyer, the USS Hugh W. Hadley, was attacked by 156 kamikaze aircraft in 90 minutes on May 11, 1945. Hadley was on radar picket duty north of Okinawa, serving as an early warning station for the main Fleet. When Japanese aircraft appeared on radar, Hadley and her companion destroyer USS Evans went to battle stations. The attack began at 1400 hours. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft dove at the two destroyers. Hadley's 5-inch guns, firing proximity-fused shells exclusively, began shooting down attackers at ranges beyond what conventional ammunition could reach. The airburst explosions from proximity fuses destroyed aircraft before they could get close enough to crash into the ship. Hadley's gun crews worked frantically, loading and firing as fast as the ammunition could be supplied. The 5-inch guns became so hot that paint blistered off the barrels. Spent shell casings piled up on the deck. The ship was enveloped in smoke from gunfire. In 90 minutes, Hadley shot down approximately 20 aircraft with her 5-inch batteries. Another 3 kamikaze aircraft hit the ship despite the defensive fire, causing severe damage. But Hadley stayed afloat and was eventually towed to safety. Without proximity fuses, naval analysts calculated that Hadley would have been overwhelmed and sunk within the first 30 minutes of the attack. The ship's commanding officer credited the proximity-fused ammunition with saving his ship and his crew. The Germans noticed the change in summer of 1944. Luftwaffe pilots attacking Allied ships during the Normandy invasion reported that anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. Shells were detonating at exactly the right altitude, even when the aircraft were taking evasive action. German intelligence analyzed the problem and concluded the Allies had developed a new type of fuse, but they didn't know how it worked. They examined wreckage from downed Allied bombers, looking for new radar systems. They monitored radio frequencies, searching for guidance signals. They captured unexploded anti-aircraft shells from the ocean near the invasion beaches and sent them to laboratories in Germany. The technicians opened the fuses, saw the miniature vacuum tubes and electronics, and correctly identified them as radio proximity fuses. They sent a detailed report to Berlin, stating that the Allies had achieved a major technological breakthrough. The report reached Wehrwirtschaftsstab, the German military procurement office. The analysts there reviewed it and dismissed it as impossible. German engineers had been working on proximity fuses since 1939. They had tried radio systems, electrostatic systems, acoustic systems. Every design had failed because the forces during gun launch destroyed the electronics. The German teams had calculated that vacuum tubes could not survive more than 5,000 Gs. Artillery shells experienced 20,000 Gs. Therefore, radio proximity fuses for artillery shells were impossible. The Allies must be using something else. Possibly a very sophisticated timed fuse. Possibly some kind of beam-riding guidance from ships. But not an actual proximity fuse. The report was filed. No countermeasures were developed. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces overran an American ammunition depot near Malmedy, Belgium. Inside the depot were 20,000 proximity fuses for artillery shells, intact, unused, ready for analysis. German engineers loaded the fuses onto trucks and transported them to laboratories in the Ruhr. They had 72 hours before Allied forces recaptured the area. In those 72 hours, they had direct access to the most advanced electronic weapon in the war. They opened the fuses. They examined the circuitry. They saw the radio transmitters and receivers. They tested the components. And then they filed them away as defective American equipment. The engineers' report stated that the fuses appeared to be attempts at radio, proximity devices, but they contained obvious design flaws. The vacuum tubes were too fragile. The battery system was unreliable. The antenna design was inefficient. Most critically, the fuses could not possibly survive being fired from a gun. The conclusion, again, was that this was not the weapon the Allies were actually using. It was either a decoy, designed to mislead German intelligence, or it was a failed experimental program. Either way, it wasn't worth copying. The 20,000 fuses were stored in a warehouse and forgotten. They were found there in April 1945 when Allied forces captured the facility. Not one had been tested in actual firing conditions. If the Germans had loaded even a single fuse into an artillery shell and fired it at a test target, they would have seen it work. They would have understood immediately what they had captured, but they never fired one. They had already concluded proximity fuses were impossible, so when they found proximity fuses, they assumed they weren't looking at proximity fuses. The American military didn't learn about the German capture until after the war. In May 1945, intelligence officers interrogated Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. General Karl Spaatz asked Göring directly about German proximity fuse development. Göring said German scientists had been working on the technology and would have had a working fuse in production in 3 to 4 months. He seemed unaware that his engineers had already examined actual American proximity fuses and rejected them as impossible. When shown photographs of the captured American fuses, Göring's expression reportedly changed. He understood what his own engineers had missed. He said nothing for several minutes. Then he asked if the Americans had been using proximity fuses in artillery shells throughout the Battle of the Bulge. Spaatz confirmed they had. Göring nodded and said that explained several things. German forces during the Bulge had reported American artillery that detonated with impossible accuracy, spraying shrapnel from overhead even when troops were in trenches or behind cover. Conventional timed fuses required visual observation to adjust fire, and the weather during the Bulge had been terrible, with heavy fog and clouds. German commanders had assumed they were safe from precision artillery because American observers couldn't see them. But the proximity fuses didn't need observers. They detonated at a fixed height above ground automatically, typically 30 to 50 feet. When an American artillery battery fired a barrage of proximity-fused shells at a grid coordinate, every single shell detonated at the perfect altitude to spray shrapnel down on anyone in the target area. Trenches provided no protection. Log bunkers provided no protection. The only defense was being somewhere else. General George Patton wrote about the new ammunition in a letter to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Army Ordnance. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. Soldiers began refusing orders to move during American artillery barrages. They knew that if shells started exploding overhead, there was no effective defense. Some units experienced minor mutinies. Officers reported difficulty maintaining discipline when proximity-fused shells were in use. One German prisoner, interrogated after the war, described the sensation of being under proximity-fused artillery fire as being inside a metal box while someone beat on it with hammers. Fast, powerful bursts everywhere. No warning, no pattern, no safe place. Just constant detonations overhead and the whine of shrapnel hitting the ground. He said it destroyed morale faster than anything else he had experienced in the war. The fuses were also used against V-1 flying, bombs attacking London. In June 1944, Germany launched 9,300 V-1s at England over an 80-day period. The unmanned jet-powered missiles flew at nearly 400 miles per hour, making them extremely difficult to intercept. The British deployed anti-aircraft batteries along the coast, firing proximity-fused shells at the incoming missiles. The results were dramatic. During the first week of V-1 attacks, anti-aircraft fire destroyed 17% of the incoming bombs. Conventional timed and contact fuses simply couldn't hit the small, fast-moving targets reliably enough. Then the British began receiving large quantities of American proximity fuses, specifically modified for use against the V-1s. Section T engineers had adjusted the fuse design to better detect the smaller radar cross-section of the V-1 compared to aircraft. By the fourth week of the campaign, using proximity-fused ammunition almost exclusively, the anti-aircraft batteries were destroying 79% of all V-1s that entered their firing zone. On one day in August, the success rate reached 82%. The V-1s that got through the coastal gunbelt still had to face fighter aircraft and barrage balloons, but the proximity fuses had eliminated the majority of the threat. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill publicly acknowledged the American contribution after the war. These so-called proximity fuses, made in the United States, proved potent against the small unmanned aircraft with which we were assailed in 1944, Churchill said. The fuses saved London from catastrophic damage. Without them, German V-1 attacks would have killed tens of thousands more civilians and possibly forced the evacuation of parts of the city. By the end of the war, the proximity fuse had fundamentally changed anti-aircraft warfare. It had turned near misses into kills. It had given defenders a decisive advantage over attackers, and it had saved thousands of lives by protecting ships and cities from air attack. Vannevar Bush, who oversaw the entire American scientific research effort during the war, said the proximity fuse was one of the three most important developments of World War II, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But unlike the atomic bomb, which was known to everyone after Hiroshima, the proximity fuse remained classified until September 1945. The security around the technology was maintained even after Germany surrendered. The fuses were still being used against Japan, and there was concern that Japanese intelligence might intercept information about how they worked. Only after Japan's surrender did the government declassify the basic information about proximity fuses. When the secrecy was finally lifted, technical details were published in newspapers and magazines. The public learned for the first time about the thousands of women who had assembled mysterious electronic devices in factories under armed guard. The workers who had assembled the fuses learned what they had been building. Many had spent years, sometimes the entire war, soldering components onto circuit boards without knowing the purpose. They had worked under intense pressure, meeting production quotas, enduring the tedium of repetitive assembly work, never told why it mattered. When they finally learned that their work had shot down enemy aircraft, protected ships from kamikaze attacks, defended London from V-1 rockets, and helped win the Battle of the Bulge, many were overwhelmed. Some cried. Some felt pride they had never felt before. They had thought they were just making radio parts. They had been saving lives. One woman who had worked at the Sylvania plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, later said that for 3 years she assembled tiny components under magnifying glasses without knowing what they became. When she learned her work had protected American sailors from Japanese aircraft, she said it was the proudest moment of her life. The Sylvania plant in Ipswich alone produced over 5,600,000 fuses, more than any other single location. Merle Tuve, the physicist who led Section T, received almost no public recognition. His name appeared in some technical papers. He was awarded a Medal for Merit by the President, a civilian decoration that few people outside the scientific community knew about. But Tuve didn't seek publicity. He had never wanted credit. He had wanted to solve the problem. After the war, Tuve returned to Carnegie Institution, where he continued his research in physics. He worked on radio astronomy, cosmic rays, and geophysics. He helped establish the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, which grew into one of America's premier research facilities. The lab continued proximity fuse research and development for decades after the war, improving the designs and adapting the technology for new weapons systems. Tuve served as director of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at Carnegie until he retired in 1966. He rarely spoke about the proximity fuse publicly. When asked about it in interviews later in his life, he said it was the kind of problem that needed solving and that his team had been fortunate to solve it before too many more men died. He estimated that the proximity fuse had saved between 50,000 and 100,000 American lives by increasing the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire and reducing ship losses. But he never quantified it precisely. He couldn't. The calculations would have required knowing how many ships would have been sunk without the fuses, how many more aircraft would have penetrated defenses, how many more sailors would have died. The counterfactual was unknowable. He just knew that ships equipped with proximity fuses shot down more attacking aircraft and suffered fewer casualties than ships that didn't have them. That was enough. The secrecy around the proximity fuse persisted for decades because the technology continued to be used in new weapons systems. Radio proximity fuses became standard equipment in anti-aircraft missiles, artillery shells, bombs, and rockets. The basic principle of using reflected radio waves to detect range and trigger detonation remained classified until the 1960s. Even then, specific details about circuit designs, radio frequencies, and reliability improvements stayed secret. Manufacturers continued to produce proximity fuses for the military using designs that descended directly from the original World War II models. By the time the full story became public in the 1970s and 80s, most of the people involved were dead or elderly. Tuve died in 1982 at age 80. Many of the Section T engineers and scientists had passed away. The women who had assembled the fuses in factories were scattered across the country. Some gave interviews to military historians in the 1990s, describing the working conditions, the secrecy, the searches, the tedious precision required to solder 130 components into a package the size of a soda can. They remembered being told their work was important, but never being told why. They remembered the relief when the war ended. They remembered the pride they felt when they finally learned what they had built. USS Helena was sunk by Japanese torpedoes in July 1943 during the Battle of Kula Gulf, but most of her crew survived. Commander Deke Parsons went on to become the weaponeer aboard the Enola Gay, responsible for arming the atomic bomb during the flight to Hiroshima. After the war, Parsons became a rear admiral and helped develop the Navy's nuclear weapons program. He died in 1953 at age 52. His obituary mentioned his role in the atomic bomb mission. It did not mention that he had been present for the first combat use of proximity fuses. The secrecy around the proximity fuse persisted for decades because the technology continued to be used in new weapons systems. Radio proximity fuses became standard in anti-aircraft missiles, artillery shells, bombs. The basic principle, using reflected radio waves to detect range and trigger detonation, remained classified until the 1960s. Even then, specific details about circuit designs and reliability improvements stayed secret. By the time the full story became public, most of the people involved were dead or elderly. Tuve died in 1982. Parsons had been gone for 30 years. The women who had assembled the fuses in factories were scattered across the country, many of them unaware that their work had been declassified. A few gave interviews to military historians in the 1990s, describing the working conditions, the secrecy, the searches, the tedious precision required to solder 130 components into a package the size of a soda can. They remembered being told their work was important, but never being told why. They remembered the relief at the end of the war, when they finally learned what they had built. The Germans never developed a working proximity fuse during the war. They had tried. German engineers had been working on the problem since the early 1930s, and by the end of the war, Allied intelligence teams discovered evidence of over 30 different proximity fuse design projects at various German research facilities. Some were based on acoustic sensors that detected engine noise. Some used electrostatic fields. Some attempted radio detection similar to the American design. A German company called Rheinmetall Borsig had developed an electrostatic proximity fuse that showed promise in testing. The fuse could detect a metal target at ranges of 10 to 15 meters and worked reliably when fired from rockets or missiles, which experienced much lower G-forces than artillery shells. But every attempt to adapt the designs for use in artillery shells failed. After the war, interrogators asked German scientists why they hadn't pursued the technology more aggressively, especially after capturing working examples during the Battle of the Bulge. The scientists said they had calculated it was impossible and that their calculations had been correct based on German manufacturing capabilities. German engineers had determined that vacuum tubes could not survive more than 5,000 Gs of acceleration. Artillery shells experienced 20,000 Gs. Therefore, radio proximity fuses for artillery shells were impossible. The mathematics was clear. The conclusion was inevitable. When German technicians examined captured American fuses after the Battle of the Bulge, they saw vacuum tubes that should have been destroyed during firing. Their conclusion was that the Americans must be using some kind of sophisticated deception. Perhaps the fuses were filled with dummy components to mislead German intelligence. Perhaps they were prototypes that had never been actually fired. The idea that the Americans had developed vacuum tubes capable of surviving 20,000 Gs seemed more implausible than the idea that the captured fuses were fake. So the Germans filed them away and focused on other weapons. They were partly right about one thing. American industry had developed manufacturing techniques that Germany couldn't replicate: the specialized vacuum tubes, the precision assembly, the quality control systems, the mass production infrastructure. All of these required industrial capacity that Germany simply didn't have by 1944. But the fundamental breakthrough wasn't manufacturing. It was believing the problem could be solved. That's how innovation happens in war. Not through committees analyzing theoretical limits, but through teams building prototypes and testing them until they work. Not through dismissing ideas as impossible, but through solving one problem at a time until the impossible becomes routine. The proximity fuse saved tens of thousands of lives because nobody told Merle Tuve's team it couldn't be done. Or rather, people told them constantly, and they ignored it. They built the fuse anyway. They made it work. They put it in ships and watched it shoot down aircraft that would have killed American sailors. And they did it while the Germans had 20,000 working examples sitting in a warehouse, gathering dust, dismissed as defective, because they violated assumptions about what was possible. Sometimes the difference between winning and losing is simply refusing to believe that a problem can't be solved. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.